Chapter 4: The Throat Wound, Entrance or Exit. One of the few facts about the Dallas tragedy undisputed by critics of the Warren Commission report is that President Kennedy was nearly dead when his car arrived at Parkland Hospital. To date, no one, not even the overseas critics, who are the least informed and most virulent, has suggested that the dying president was delivered to Parkland as part of a preconceived plan to ensure his demise. Kennedy's driver, Secret Service agent Bill Greer, gunned his blood-spattered Lincoln convertible up to 80 miles an hour when he hit Stemmons Freeway after zooming through the triple underpass. Take it easy," Agent Emery Roberts radioed from the Queen Mary, the huge Cadillac security car trailing behind him. "If he's not dead, we don't want to kill him now." Greer slowed down to 60 miles an hour, half top speed for the president's 2.5-ton limousine, and with Dallas police leading the way, made the 4-mile run to Parkland's emergency entrance in about 5 minutes. There, the first physician to see the president was Dr. Charles J. Carrico, a 28-year-old surgical resident. He was on an ambulance cart, Dr. Carrico later testified. His color was blue-white ashen. He had slow, agonal respiration, spasmodic respirations without any coordination. He was making no voluntary movements. His eyes were open, pupils were seen to be dilated, and later were seen not to react to light. He had no palpable pulse. The president, in Dr. Carrico's words, was clearly a terminal patient, but for the next 15 minutes, he and 7 other doctors tried frantically to maintain the feeble sounds which we felt to be heartbeats, detected when they opened his shirt and listened to his chest. In an effort to clear an air passage to his lungs, Dr. Carrico first inserted a plastic endotracheal tube through his mouth, past his throat wound, and connected it to a respirator. Other doctors performed cut-downs on the president's ankles and on his left arm, small incisions through which they inserted tubes into his veins and administered blood, salt solution, and hydrocortisone. Dr. Carrico remembered reading that the president suffered an adrenal insufficiency, once erroneously described by his political opponents as Addison's disease, and ordered the hydrocortisone transfusion. Observing that the president's respiration was ineffective, Dr. Malcolm Perry, attending staff surgeon, performed a tracheotomy, making an incision through the president's throat wound to insert a new breathing tube. At the same time, 2 other doctors inserted tubes in the president's right chest to drain off accumulated blood. As the president's blood pressure failed and a cardiac monitor indicated his heart was failing, Dr. Perry and Dr. William Kemp Clark, chief of neurosurgery, administered external heart massage. This, too, failed. At about 1 p.m., Dr. Clark pronounced the president dead. Following his death, and a bitter dispute between White House and local officials over whether his body could be removed from Texas without an inquest, the president's body was wrapped in a hospital bedsheet, placed in a bronze casket, and returned to Washington aboard Air Force One, a sad journey that, like most of the things connected with Kennedy's death, later became a matter of controversy. The fact that the president died in Texas, was removed without an inquest, and the autopsy to determine the cause of his death was conducted at the Bethesda, Maryland Naval Hospital, 1,200 miles away, laid the foundation for a needless misunderstanding as to the nature of his wounds. There has never been any doubt as to which of the wounds proved fatal. The neck wound was tolerable. The shot that tore into his brain and exploded the right side of his skull was insurvivable. But the fact that the Texas doctors who first treated the president took no part in the autopsy and, in fact, were not consulted until the following morning by the Bethesda autopsy team created an atmosphere of confusion. The confusion was compounded by the fact that 2 of the 3 Texas doctors held a press conference at Parkland Hospital barely an hour after the president's death and long before they fully comprehended what had happened to the president. It was further complicated by the fact that the three pathologists who conducted the autopsy at Bethesda began their task unaware there had been a bullet hole in the president's throat before the tracheotomy was performed. It was then prolonged by the refusal of the Navy and the Warren Commission to make public the autopsy findings until the Warren Commission submitted its report nearly a year later. Although the communications gap between the Texas and Bethesda doctors was finally closed, and although the confusion in the public's mind about Kennedy's wounds was amply explained and, to most reasonable men, dispelled by the Warren Commission report, critics of the commission have found the Dallas-Bethesda mix-up a fertile field in which to sow seeds of doubt. Because the Texas doctors spoke first and spoke, as they later admitted, without having seen two bullet holes in the president's body, because they spoke before any scientific effort had been made to analyze the president's wounds, some Warren critics have pounced upon their early offhand remarks in an effort to prove that one or both of the bullets that struck Kennedy were fired from some place other than the Texas School Book Depository. This would either exonerate Oswald or establish that he had an accomplice. To do this, the critics have tried hardest to prove that the wound in President Kennedy's throat was an entrance wound. Mark Lane, the most strident advocate of the entry wound theory, sets up the argument in an either-or proposition. If the bullet that struck his throat came from the knoll, then the wound must have been an entrance wound, he says. If the bullet came from the book depository behind the limousine, then it must have been an exit wound. Apart from the fact that the first sentence of his equation cleverly begs the question by stating flatly that a bullet struck the throat, it is admissible as a basis for argument. But from that point on, the gaps in Lane's logic and his unwillingness to accept or even note the sworn testimony of all who oppose his theory are shocking. Beyond that, his deceptive use of references and partial quotes, carefully selected and neatly removed from context, raises serious questions about his purpose. First, he seizes upon newspaper accounts of the press conference conducted at Parkland Hospital just 1 hour after the president died. The conference was conducted by Dr. Perry, who performed the tracheotomy on Kennedy, and Dr. Clark, who pronounced him dead and signed his death certificate. Both doctors agreed to the press conference with misgivings. In their desperate effort to maintain a flickering spark of life in the president, as we have seen, no Parkland doctor had made a careful examination of the president's body. None, in fact, had even turned his body over on the emergency cart in Trauma Room 1. This was an acutely ill patient, explained Dr. Carrico, and all we had time to do was to determine what things were life-threatening right then and attempt to resuscitate him. Dr. Perry described his examination as cursory. As a result, no doctor at Parkland had seen either of the wounds later established as entrance wounds by the autopsy team at Bethesda. None had any clear idea how many bullets had struck the president or where or what course they had taken through his body. Nowhere in his book, not in one sentence or fragment of a sentence, does Lane mention these overpowering facts. The press conference was bedlam, Dr. Perry said later of his hastily organized encounter with some 100 newsmen who shouted questions and often cut him off in mid-sentence when he attempted to answer. A question would be asked, and you would incompletely answer it, he told the Warren Commission, and another question would be asked, and they had gotten what they wanted without really understanding. And they would go on, and it would go out of context. For example, on the speculation on the ultimate source of the bullets, I obviously knew less about it than most people because I was in the hospital at the time and didn't know the circumstances surrounding it until it was over. I was much too busy, and yet I was quoted as saying that there was probably one bullet which struck and deviated upward, which came from the front, and what I had replied was to a question, Was it conceivable that this could have happened? And I said, yes, it is conceivable. However the question was asked, and whatever his reply, Dr. Perry was quoted in at least two newspapers the next day as having said there was an entrance wound below his, the president's, Adam apple. Lane bases his case for a throat wound of entry and thus for a gunman on the grassy knoll largely on this contemporaneous opinion by Dr. Perry, even though Dr. Perry has since denied making that statement and has argued quite convincingly, in any case, that he was then in no position to make such a judgment. But Lane is not content merely to misrepresent Dr. Perry. In his book, he states blandly that it was the unanimous belief of all the doctors who expressed an opinion during the days following the assassination that the hole in the throat was an entrance wound. This egregious misstatement has been picked up and reported as a fact by dozens of reviewers of Lane's book who quite obviously never read the Warren Commission report, let alone its 26 volumes of testimony and exhibits. The fact is that none of the doctors ever made such a finding. Despite his disputed press conference remarks, Dr. Perry was explicit in his denial to the Warren Commission that he ever made such a finding. For one thing, Dr. Perry told the Commission, he couldn't accurately describe the throat wound because blood obscured any detail about the edges as he performed the tracheotomy. An exit wound usually, but not always, has ragged edges. What was the condition of the edges of the wound, if you can recollect? A commissioner attorney asked. I couldn't state with certainty due to the fact that they were covered by blood, and I did not make a minute examination, he said. I determined only the fact that there was a wound there, roughly 5 millimeters or so in size. Were there sufficient facts available to you to reach a conclusion as to the cause of the wound on the front side of the president's neck? The commission lawyer asked. No, sir, I could not, replied Dr. Perry. I could not determine whether or how this was inflicted per se, since it would require tracing the trajectory. No effort was made to trace the trajectory of any bullets at Parkland. Arlen Specter, assistant counsel for the commission, pressed Dr. Perry on what he might have said at the press conference, particularly whether he had said that one bullet might have entered the throat and caused the massive head wound on exit. I was asked if this were one bullet, how would it occur, and I said, it is conceivable or possible that a bullet could enter and strike the spinal column and be deviated superiorly to exit the head. This was speculation, Dr. Perry said, adding that he labeled it as such at the time. In the end, given the knowledge of the bullet hole in the president's right rear shoulder, Dr. Perry was asked if the throat wound would be consistent with an exit wound. It would, he said. He also concurred in the findings of the Bethesda autopsy team. I think there are no discrepancies at all, he said. In his sweeping generalization about the unanimous opinion of the Parkland medics, Lane did similar violence to the views of Dr. Carrico, the only other physician to examine the throat wound before Dr. Perry performed the tracheotomy that obliterated its outlines. Specter asked Dr. Carrico about any conversations he might have had with other doctors concerning the throat wound after the president's death. As I recall, Dr. Perry and I talked and tried later in the afternoon, to determine what exactly had happened, and we were not aware of the missile wound to the back and postulated that this was either a tangential wound from a fragment, possibly another entrance wound, he said. It could have been an exit wound, but we knew of no other entrance wound. Was the wound in the neck consistent with being either an entry or exit wound in your opinion? Yes. Or did it look to be more one than the other? No, it could have been either, depending on the size of the missile, the velocity of the missile, the tissues that it struck. Given a 6.5 millimeter missile traveling at 2,000 feet per second, fired from a distance of 160 to 250 feet, and striking the tissues that were hit in President Kennedy's neck, Dr. Carrico expressed the opinion that it would leave just the kind of exit wound he first saw in Kennedy's throat. In trying to make his point, Lane plays fast and loose with medical terminology and sometimes substitutes his own opinion for that of the doctors. For example, he reports that Dr. Carrico signed a hospital report after Kennedy died, describing the throat wound as one of entrance. Actually, in his report, Dr. Carrico described the hole in the throat as a small, penetrating wound. In medical parlance, penetrating is not exactly synonymous with entrance. An object may penetrate the skin from within or without, but it can only enter from without the body. The word penetrating implies a deep wound rather than a superficial wound. Again, we see the importance of checking Lane's impressionistic summaries against the actual words of the participant. Even when Lane boldly gives us chapter and verse references in his voluminous footnotes. Another example. In his truncated summary of Dr. Perry's testimony, Lane reports that although he, Dr. Perry, avoided using the word entrance, the wound he described had all the characteristics of a wound of entry. Here, in spite of Dr. Perry's sworn opinion that the wound could have been one of exit or entry, Lane is clearly asking us to believe, apparently on the basis of his medical knowledge, that the doctor actually described an entrance wound. In his effort to obfuscate the wound question, Lane spends almost no time at all on a critical question raised by his theory. If the hole in Kennedy's throat was an entrance wound caused by a bullet fired from the grassy knoll, what became of the bullet? Investigators recovered only one object that could be called a bullet, the nearly whole missile found at Parkland Hospital, and fragments of another in the president's car. Both were traced to Oswald's rifle. No bullets were found in the president's body, nor does Lane claim there were any exit wounds on the rear of the president's neck or head. He suggests, in fact, that the gaping wound on the right side of the president's head was also an entrance wound caused by another shot fired from the grassy knoll. What then became of the bullet that he says pierced the president's throat? Lane displays an amazing indifference to important detail and with gross disregard for what the Dallas doctors said. If the bullet which caused what the Dallas physicians described as an entrance wound in the president's throat was fired from the knoll or from any of several other vantage points, he says, it might have exited over the rear of the car. In that event, a search of the limousine or of the other occupants would have been of little use in locating it. Such reasoning must assume that there was an exit wound through which the bullet passed before it disappeared over the rear of the car. Since the Bethesda autopsy team reported no such exit wound, it is implicit in Lane's book that they willfully and maliciously concealed knowledge of such a wound. As with almost every other theory of Lane's, in the end it falls unsupported unless the reader is willing to accept the idea of a giant conspiracy. In his inquest, Epstein, who started his book as a master's thesis at Cornell, stops short of the conspiracy charge but suggests that Oswald must have had an accomplice or, even more implausibly, that another marksman not connected with Oswald fired at the same time. He then goes on to make a charge just as sinister in its implications as Lane's, that the Bethesda autopsy findings were altered by persons he doesn't name so that the Warren Commission could rule out the possibility of a second assassin. Epstein bases this sensational charge, couched mildly in academic language, largely on two FBI documents he found in the National Archives. One is an FBI summary report on the assassination dated December 9th, 1963, and the other a supplemental report dated January 13th, 1964. both appeared to contradict flatly the Bethesda autopsy finding that the bullet which entered Kennedy's shoulder exited through his throat. The summary report said medical examination of the president's body revealed that one of the bullets had entered just below his shoulder to the right of the spinal cord at an angle of 45 to 60 degrees downward, that there was no point of exit, and that the bullet was not in the body. It would be impossible, of course, for a bullet, once having entered the body, to have no point of exit and still not be in the body. But what this seemed to suggest was that the bullet lodged in Kennedy's shoulder, then dropped out somewhere before his body arrived at Bethesda. The supplemental report was more specific. It said medical examination had revealed that the bullet which entered his back had penetrated to a distance of less than a finger length. If true, this certainly ruled out an exit through the throat. After quoting these reports, Epstein reasons that since they were written after the autopsy, there could be no doubt that the autopsy findings were known to the FBI when it prepared the summary report. Then how can the contradiction on this essential point be explained? Epstein does it nimbly by concluding, number one, that the FBI autopsy report was probably right. Number two, that the original Bethesda autopsy report must have come to the same conclusion. And number three, that the Bethesda autopsy report in the Warren Commission report was not the original, but an altered substitute. If this is in fact the case, he writes, hedging just a little, the significance of this alteration of fact goes far beyond merely indicating that it was not physically impossible for a lone assassin to have accomplished the assassination. It indicates that the conclusions of the Warren report must be viewed as expressions of political truth. An academese accusing the commission of political truth is the same as saying that it lied, that it turned its back on unsettling evidence of a second assassin. And this fits neatly into Epstein's thesis that the dominant purpose of the commission was to reassure the nation and protect the national interest, regardless of the truth. It is an interesting thesis, but there is considerable evidence that Epstein neglected to ascertain the truth in arriving at it. He did not ascertain, or he did not tell his readers at least, that the two startling FBI reports, which he sometimes calls autopsy reports, were written not from the Bethesda autopsy findings, but from what two FBI agents overheard while watching the autopsy. Special agents Francis X. O'Neill Jr. and James W. Siebert stood by for the FBI, along with two Secret Service agents who had just returned from Dallas, Roy Kellerman and Bill Greer, while two Navy pathologists, Commanders James J. Humes and J. Thornton Boswell, and an Army specialist in forensic medicine, Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink, made their examination of Kennedy's body. The examination, including the taking of photographs and x-rays, lasted from 8 to about 11 p.m. In Dr. Hume's mind, the four agents were there as security personnel. They left the room at intervals for coffee, to relieve themselves, and to make phone calls. During the examination, Dr. Humes discovered, for the first time, the entrance wound on the president's right rear shoulder. When he probed the wound first with his finger and then with a surgical probe and found no bullet, he was puzzled. Then, at Dr. Fink's suggestion, he ordered an x-ray of the entire body in an effort to find the bullet. When the x-ray revealed no bullet, Dr. Humes remarked that it might have worked its way out through the entrance wound during external heart massage at Parkland. Although it seemed unlikely to the doctors, all experienced in gunshot wounds, that a high-velocity bullet would make so shallow a wound, this thought gained some credence when one of the FBI agents, after a phone call downtown, reported that a bullet had been found on one of the emergency carts at Parkland. It was a transient thought, Dr. Boswell recalled later. On internal examination of the president, the doctors found evidence the bullet had gone through the president's neck, bruises on the neck muscles, the uppermost tip of the right lung, and the membrane that lines the lung cage. The autopsy doctors agreed that night that there must have been an exit wound through the throat before the tracheotomy incision was made. They couldn't confirm this, however, until the next morning when Dr. Humes called Dr. Perry in Dallas. On that day, November 23rd, they reviewed their data and reached their conclusions. Dr. Humes drafted their report on November 24th. Typed up and signed, it was delivered to the White House on November 25th. Special Agents O'Neill and Siebert delivered the report to the FBI. Apparently, they had tuned out as eavesdroppers early in the examination. In any case, they had left the Bethesda morgue unaware that the doctors had discovered a bullet path through Kennedy's neck and still unaware that the president had been brought into Parkland with an exit wound, or any wound, in his throat. They reported Dr. Boswell's transient thought that a bullet had fallen out of a shallow shoulder wound during heart massage as the finding of the autopsy team. Their garbled hearsay report was the basis for the inaccurate description of Kennedy's wounds in both the FBI summary report of December 9th and the supplemental report of January 13th. Thus, readers of Epstein, who is usually skeptical of FBI reports, were touted on to an inaccurate FBI report and asked to take the word of 2 FBI agents over that of the 3 pathologists who performed the autopsy. And what of Epstein's assertion that there can be no doubt that the autopsy findings were known to the FBI when it prepared the summary report? Wrong again, according to the FBI and the Secret Service, the 2 agencies involved. Vice Admiral George Berkeley, the White House physician to whom Commander Humes delivered the official autopsy report, handed it over to the Secret Service for transmittal to the Warren Commission after the commission was named on November 29th. The Secret Service delivered the report to the commission in early December, but didn't get around to giving the FBI a copy until December 23rd. By then, the summary report, a 4-volume review of the assassination in which the inaccurate version of the autopsy was but a small part, had already gone to press. FBI officials concede that they got the Bethesda report before putting out the revised and updated supplemental report in January, but somehow didn't catch the error. FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover has since stated publicly that he has no quarrel with any part of the Warren report, including the original and only Bethesda autopsy report. Thus, where Epstein could have charged bureaucratic bungling and made it stick, he chose instead to allege collusion and fraud and to confuse his readers. Finally, what of Epstein's sweeping statement? If the FBI reports are accurate, as all the evidence indicates they are, then a central aspect of the autopsy was changed more than 2 months after the autopsy examination, and the autopsy report published in the Warren Report is not the original one. Finally, what of Epstein's sweeping statement? If the FBI reports are accurate, as all the evidence indicates they are, then a central aspect of the autopsy was changed more than 2 months after the autopsy examination, and the autopsy report published in the Warren Report is not the original one. The other evidence Epstein has is his own belief, unsupported by any findings of the FBI or autopsy team, that the bullets which penetrated Kennedy's shoulder entered too low to exit from his throat, just below the Adam's apple. And here again, he appears to mislead his readers. First, he points out that the FBI summary report said that the bullet entered Kennedy just below his shoulder. This imprecise lay language would be startling if by below the shoulder the FBI report writer meant below the shoulder blade, but if he meant that it entered below the top line of the shoulder where it joins the neck, a more common usage, then he would be merely confirming what the doctors reported in more precise terms. Epstein next takes on the doctors. He points to Commission Exhibit 397, a page from the Bethesda autopsy report containing 2 rough sketches of the president's body, one front view and one rear, drawn by Dr. Boswell, not Dr. Humes, as Epstein says, during the autopsy. On the front view, he says, the throat wound is just below the collar line, while on the rear view, the entrance wound is much farther down, below the collar line. While referring to these crude drawings, which Dr. Boswell has called a scratch sheet, Epstein makes no reference to the precise measurement figures noted in longhand during the autopsy, which appear next to them. The figures placed the entrance wound precisely at the intersection of two 14-centimeter arcs, one drawn from the right acromion process, the highest point on the shoulder bone that can be felt near the joint of the shoulder and the collarbone, and the other from the right mastoid process, a bony prominence behind the ear. In other words, the figures on the drawing, using two standard anatomical reference points, clearly describe the wound as being 5.51185 inches below the bony prominence under the president's right ear. This placed it above the exit wound in his throat, but Epstein ignored this and chose instead to refer to a pencil mark on a rough drawing indicating the approximate location of entry, and to tell his readers this showed the entrance wound to be below the exit wound. Epstein then takes on the FBI, finding in the FBI supplemental report photographs of the shirt and suit coat Kennedy was wearing when shot. He decides that the bullet perforations in them prove his contention that the rear entrance wound was lower than the wound in the throat. These photographs, which were omitted from the Warren Report and the 26 volumes of supporting evidence, he says, show that the bullet hole in the jacket is 5 3/8 inches below the collar, and that the bullet hole in the shirt is 5 3/4 inches below the collar. This sounds bad for the Warren Commission and the FBI, which had custody of the shirt and jacket. It suggests that, together, the Commission and the FBI suppressed both the pictures and the measurements. It suggests also that the shoulder wound was lower than either of them is willing to admit. A perusal of Volume 17 of the Warren Commission's hearings, however, discloses two pictures each of the president's bloody shirt and jacket, plus a picture of his necktie, which was nicked by the exiting bullet. And in Volume 5, there is the testimony of FBI agent Robert Frazier, a ballistics expert, putting into the record the measurements Epstein quotes. This absolves the FBI and the Commission of the implied charge of suppressing evidence. On closer scrutiny, however, there is an important difference between Frazier's testimony and what Epstein tells his readers. Where Frazier says the holes were 5 3/8 and 5 3/4 inches below the top of the collar, Epstein says simply that they were those distances below the collar. By omitting the word top in each case, Epstein has cleverly moved the holes down by about an inch, at least in the minds of people who read his inquest and not Volume 5 of the hearings. A mere inch may seem a small thing over which to quibble with Epstein, wrote Fletcher Nebel of Look, who first blew the whistle on this distortion of evidence, but his entire case involves fractions of feet and fractions of seconds. If Epstein can gain an inch, he resembles a high school team gaining a yard against the Cleveland Browns for first down. After a close reading of Epstein, Nebel found him devious and guilty of the sins of which he accuses the Warren Commission: distortion, ignoring testimony, sifting the evidence, and adroitly selecting it to fit his theories and assumptions. But unfortunately, since more people read book reviews than books, many reviewers were taken in by Epstein's scholarly, restrained style and his apparent grasp of the Kennedy case. A reputable journalist who wrote the introduction to Inquest, Richard Rovery, even concluded that the book was something to make scholars proud and journalists envious and ashamed. If any journalists are ashamed, it should be because some of them treated Epstein's thesis as a startling, factual expose. It remained for a British legal scholar, Lord Devlin, to dispatch Epstein's spectral second gunman. It is one thing to produce, as Mr. Epstein has done, he wrote, an emanation of an accomplice whose presence is inferred as necessary to explain circumstantial evidence, and another to postulate a man of flesh and blood who had a gun which he actually fired, and who has vanished with his gun into thin air, leaving no trace, not even of a bullet, of who he was and of what he did.